and this is Politically Unstable. This week, I'm joined by Robert Wilkie, who was the Secretary of Veterans Affairs under Donald J. Trump's presidency, and is a distinguished fellow at AFPI. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, you wrote a very interesting column this week for us, discussing kind of Biden's reaction to what's happening in the Middle East, as well, and comparing that to former presidents, former President Jefferson and Adams, and the actions that they took during their presidency. Can you kind of recap exactly kind of the premise of your column and why you feel it's important in today's day and age?
Sure. Well, America's been embroiled in this part of the world since the beginning of the Republic. During the first and second Washington administrations and the Adams administration, the Barbary pirates, which were an extension of the Turkish Sultan, ravaged American commerce in the Mediterranean. They imprisoned our sailors, sold them off into slavery, and destroyed our ships. Um, the Adams administration paid the Barbary pirates the day of Algiers, who was in charge, a ransom. This was at the same time that the French had captured over 315 American ships, and the Federalist Party, the ruling party of John Adams, came up with the slogan, "Millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute." But the French continued to raid our ships, and the Adams administration paid the sum of $1 million to the Algerian pirates to stop preying on American vessels. The election of 1800, which probably was the nastiest election in our history, nothing in modern times compares to it. Jefferson, the head of the new Democrat Republican Party, and painted as sort of this mystic farmer who was out of touch with the real world, really hones in on the notion that this nation was paying tribute to the Barbary pirates, what he called the tyrants of Araby, and he hammered Adams. Of course, he wins the election, and within a few months of him doing that, he dispatches the entire fleet and he begins to lay waste to Libya, modern day Libya, Algeria, and Tunis. He bombards Tripoli. He introduces the United States Marine Corps to the world. They embark on 1,000-mile trek across North Africa, and they invest what is the modern day city of Derna in Libya, and kill 1,000 Arabs, with the loss of just 14 Americans killed and wounded. And all of a sudden, the Barbary pirates sue for peace. Well, this quasi peace lasts just for a few years until the War of 1812 breaks out. And the Royal Navy blockades American harbors, and whatever American commerce gets through is preyed upon in the Mediterranean by the Barbary pirates. When James Madison signs the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, this time, he dispatches the United States fleet, a battle-hardened fleet, a fleet that had stood toe-to-toe with the world's most powerful military force, the Royal Navy, and this time with Stephen Decatur in command. In April of 1815, they destroy the entire Arab fleet off Cape Gata, and Decatur sends a note to the ruler of Algiers, "Surrender or we burn your capital."
Mhm.
And that was the end of the Barbary Wars. What was fascinating is that Jefferson, who has always been painted as sort of this reclusive peacenik, unleashed his revolutionary fury, which in many instances was founded on his hatred of hereditary monarchy, which we were certainly seeing in Arabia at the time, and state-imposed religion. And in fact, one of the things the Barbary pirates were doing is they were telling the American sailors, "You either convert or you die." And of course, Jefferson said enough of that. And he really established a foundational principle, which has been upheld by every American president since that time, with the exception of Joe Biden. And that was the right of innocent passage. that the United States, and then later in conjunction with Great Britain when we became friends, would make sure that international shipping lanes were open to all the peoples of the world. And that was something that Jefferson laid down for posterity, and that we have. In fact, it's interesting because, of course, he was a Southern planter, and even though he could see that the commercial power of the North would one day overwhelm the South, he knew that if you couldn't get ships out, the South couldn't sell its cotton, its rice, its indigo, its tar from North Carolina, and the South would be bankrupted and was being bankrupted by this type of war. And he and Madison both put their feet down and destroyed this threat, not only to the U.S. but also to international shipping.
So, flash forward to today. We know over the past weekend, the Biden administration launched, attacks on key targets, and one was against the Houthis, and the Houthis are an Iranian-backed proxy terrorist group. The Trump administration labeled them a terrorist group when the Biden administration first came in. They took them off of that designation. They since tried to designate them a terrorist group, but the Houthis haven't stopped. They haven't stopped their attacks on ships in the Red Sea since this weekend's retaliatory strikes. So, what action do you think is needed from the Biden administration to put an end to this? After all, two Marines have been killed
Right.
in defending these shipping lanes.
Well, let's talk about those shipping lanes. The busiest shipping lanes are the shipping lanes outside of Taiwan. Those are the most traversed shipping lanes on the planet. And we can go back to even Dwight Eisenhower's time when the communists had taken control of communist China. One of the first things Dwight Eisenhower did when he became president was make sure that the Chinese saw the United States fleet moving up and down those straits. The Red Sea is the second most traveled international shipping lane on the planet. It is vital, particularly for Europe and their energy consumption. Uh, Billions and billions of dollars of goods go through that area every month. And during the Biden presidency, these Houthi rebels, brigands, have been able to shut off 60% of the commerce in the world's second busiest sea lanes. In fact, in very sight of the United States Navy, the Houthis have been able to cross the Gulf of Aden, and they now have forces on the African side of the Gulf where they can bracket the entire sea lane. What does that require in terms of a response from the United States? It does not require what we have seen, which is a tit for tat response. In the broader Middle East, it's 160 attacks with 5 responses. That kind of thing, from a military perspective, means that you have ceded the operational tempo to the enemy. They call the shots, you don't. And the only thing that will stop is a sustained air and sea campaign that destroys the Houthis' will to fight, and by extension, sends a message to the Iranians. Now, the addition to a sustained campaign against the Houthis is to do what Ronald Reagan did. The same thing happened in the 1980s. The Iranians threatened international shipping in the Persian Gulf. Ronald Reagan sent the United States fleet. Margaret Thatcher sent the Royal Navy, and they escorted these vessels through the Persian Gulf. When the Iranians still tried to mine those waters, Reagan took out not only all of their vessels in the Persian Gulf, but he destroyed all of their offshore oil platforms. That was
Mhm.
actually the world's introduction to then Lieutenant Colonel Jim Mattis, who was the Marine commander who destroyed all of those oil platforms. We certainly don't see that kind of resolve from this administration. Not only would they not attack the Houthis, they won't sink the Iranian vessels that are shadowing our ships throughout the Red Sea.
Now, one of the things that the Biden administration says is they don't want to escalate this war. They don't want to draw us uh, into a World War III. That's something that they're worried about. So the actions that they're taking, they say, are commiserate with what the Houthis are doing to us. It's not to escalate things. What do you say to that line that they constantly repeat over and over again to the
Right.
press?
Well, yeah, repeating it doesn't make true. I've always written it off to, Ivy League faculty lounge lunacy. The other side has already escalated. Americans have died, and our allies are threatened. And they have such little understanding of modern political and military history that if they look back at what Ronald Reagan did and what Donald Trump did with the Iranians, once you strike at something vital to the Iranian state, they go back into their hole. Reagan destroyed their fleet, destroyed their ability to produce oil, and they went silent. Donald Trump killed the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and they did nothing. We are not doing anything to put people or assets that the Iranian state considers vital to their survival at risk, and that is one of the great tragedies that I see unfolding with this administration. And I'll give you a quick story from my childhood. I was a youngster at Fort Bragg when the hostages were taken by the Iranians in 1979. I was actually sitting at a JV football game outside of Fort Bragg, and I remember my history teachers saying after the hostages were taken, one of the teachers said, "Anybody who wants us can have us," because that's what we had become under Jimmy Carter. And then a few weeks after that, somebody put a massive billboard on Fort Bragg Boulevard, facing my father's unit, the 82nd Airborne Division, saying, "Iran, let our people go." And that's what we had become, this toothless tiger begging these theocratic fanatics to let our people go. And Biden is Jimmy Carter on steroids, because at least Carter, in the last year of his presidency, had an epiphany. He said, "I was wrong. I was wrong about communism. I was wrong about the Iranians." And he began to put in train production of things like the B 1 bomber and the Abrams tank. It didn't save his presidency, but it gave Ronald Reagan a foundation on which to build America's military resurgence. I don't expect that from this administration. It's blinkered ideologically. Give you another quick example. Um, President Trump brought peace to the Middle East when they said that it couldn't be done. He actually lowered the valiance of the Palestinian issue by going to the Arab nations and saying, "Look, you need to tie your future to this economic giant over here in Israel to bring peace and prosperity to the region." The last part of that chessboard was Saudi Arabia. What did this administration do upon entering office? It threw the Saudis overboard to try to buy off the Iranians to the tune of tens of billions of dollars in payments, taking off the sanctions. Um, Under Trump, they had less than $5 billion of reserves. They were selling less than $4 billion of oil a year. But now they're selling upwards of $70 billion of oil a year. The terrorist designation came off the Houthis, and we have reaped the whirlwind.
Why do you think the Biden administration is so reluctant to change course here? I mean, they've picked up where Obama left off. They want to pursue the JCPOA. They want to pursue a deal with Iran. But given where we are today and where the Middle East is today, why don't you see them backtracking from that course? I
Right.
just don't understand. You said Carter had an epiphany. Why don't
Yeah.
you think anyone within the Biden administration or Joe Biden himself can learn from history and change course?
Well, these are the smartest people on the planet. Just ask them. They went to all the right schools, they have all the right credentials. They are ideologically blinkered. They actually come from a culture that believes that America's international legacy is repugnant, that we are responsible for most of the problems on the planet. You saw that the first day that our current UN ambassador gave her maiden speech, her first speech at the UN, when she invited the UN Human Rights Council to investigate racism in this country. A human rights council populated by those paragons of virtue: Venezuela, Russia, China. And then the Secretary of State compounded that by actually issuing the formal invitation to the UN Human Rights Council to do the same thing. That's translated throughout this administration. And then you see civil servants who come from and these people come from the same world, actually going out of their offices in protest to support Hamas, butchers. The world is upside down. And I will say something that President Trump said. The next 10 months have to come really fast, because the Iranians are the small actor of this in this triumvirate that includes Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi. They're watching, and I will conclude that set of remarks by reminding people that the things that the media will not let them hear. There was peace in this region for 4 years. The Ayatollahs were quiet. Russia was quiet. And I can just point to when I was at the Pentagon before I went to VA, when the Russians got too close to our troops in Syria, President Trump said, back off. They didn't. And 300 of them disappeared in a red mist. And Putin got that message really fast. Don't see anything like that with this administration. And I don't expect Mr. Biden, who's wrong about Vietnam, he was wrong about Central America, he was wrong about the Strategic Defense Initiative. He even voted against killing Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
This is a record of failure that really is unsurpassed. And it was all right when he would just make speeches in the United States Senate because he wasn't responsible for anything. But now he's got the levers of kinetic power and doesn't know how to use them.
So, as you mentioned, in 10 months, there's going to be an election. Let's say it looks like right now that Donald Trump is the presumptive nominee for the GOP. It'll be a head-to-head, like in 2020 repeat, basically. Let's say Donald Trump wins. What should be his first actions coming into this? Because just based on what you're saying right now, this isn't going to be resolved in 10 months. The Biden administration is not going to change course. It could actually be heightened by that period of time. What actions should the U.S. take immediately after, if there is a change in the presidency?
Right. Well, I think I will try to use a Trumpian term that he hasn't used, but I can hear him. A message to the Ayatollahs: who's next? Any of your ships that come close to our vessels will be sunk. Your leadership is now in the crosshairs. We know where you are. And I would expect a massive response if there were Houthi-like attacks. I actually would assume, though, that the Iranians would, the same thing that they did with Ronald Reagan. They went into hiding. The hostages were released the day Reagan was inaugurated because and we know from intelligence that they had a legitimate fear that Tehran was going to be turned into a parking lot by the new president of the United States. And I think they would have that same fear with President Trump the second time around.
Well, it's that old adage, peace through strength. And we've seen it throughout history work time and time again. And it's this appeasement to the Iranian regime that the Biden administration just seems committed to has unleashed, chaos within the Middle East right now. And that's a direct result of his policies. Thank you so much for joining us this week. I appreciate the historical context. I encourage all of our viewers to check out your column. And thank you again for joining us.